This morning for our message, I'm excited to wrap up this series for the common good. I don't know if you've experienced this, but you're not supposed to feel like no one can see you when you're surrounded by a crowd. You're not supposed to feel like you're at a distance from everyone when you're stopped on a highway in a traffic jam at 2 p.m. You aren't supposed to feel like you're alone in a place with 4 times the population density of where you come from. You aren't supposed to feel like you're lost in the wilderness when you're in the second largest city in America. But I did. That's the funny thing about wilderness or about wandering, is that it doesn't seem to follow any particular set of rules. It doesn't follow supposed tos or should haves. The funny thing about existing in wilderness is that it's a place of contradictions. I would guess that perhaps you've experienced that too. For me, this particular wilderness was in March of 2012. It was in the middle of a semester in between, a semester floating between a very fond known and a very foreign unknown. I had finished my undergraduate career, and I was spending one last semester in Manhattan working for the university and enjoying that. But I was also planning and preparing and exploring and looking ahead to my seminary career that would start the following fall. And if I can confess to you, I had no idea what I was doing, no idea what I was looking for, no idea what questions I was supposed to ask, no idea what the trail ahead was. I had no idea on earth why I was even pursuing this degree, except that I had felt called to it. And so that's where I found myself. At this particular moment, I was in Los Angeles. I was set to visit the last of the grad schools that I had applied to. And so I had flown in on a Thursday morning, rented a car, and driven across LA in the afternoon. That's where I was parked on a highway at 1:30 p.m., experience that I don't particularly want to repeat. But I'd spent some time later that afternoon talking to staff at the school there, and I had the evening off before I was to continue my visit the following day. So all of that is happening in LA, but in the midst of all of this, I had another school on the other side of the country who had given me a deadline of noon the next day, by the way, noon their time, to make a decision about whether I would accept their scholarship and attend their school. And so there I was in LA, having no idea what I was doing, what questions I was supposed to be asking, what it looked like to move forward. And I had this big decision to make that felt honestly too big for me to make. Like I knew too little, like I couldn't make a good decision. The scriptures are full of wilderness moments. The scriptures speak about it a lot. They speak about these disorienting moments. They happen over and over again, and I think they happen over and over again in the scriptures because they happen over and over again in our life. These moments, like I found myself in LA, are moments of wilderness. I think the scriptures talk about them so much to help us make sense of things that sometimes don't make sense in our lives. So I don't know about you, friends, but when I find myself in one of those metaphorical wilderness moments, as I did in LA, surrounded by 4 million of my best friends that I was yet to meet, I oftentimes, almost always, find myself wanting to draw into a literal wilderness place. I want to give my brain space to think. I want to be able to breathe the air. And so that's what I did that night in LA. I drove up into the mountains outside of Los Angeles, and I began thinking and reflecting and praying. And I began just saying to God, I need some kind of direction, some kind of wisdom. I need some kind of way forward, because it didn't seem like I knew what it was, but for the first little while I was up there on the mountain, it didn't seem like that was getting me anywhere. That's the experience of the wilderness. It doesn't seem like we're getting anywhere. And so then I began to frame the questions differently. I began to ask, where do I belong? What is the right choice? I had a choice to make, what school to attend. I had a finite number of options, the schools that would take me. And I had a little bit of a time crunch. Oftentimes those things, the finite time, the finite options and big decisions nonetheless, they're ingredients that send us into a wilderness moment. We look for that place where we belong, but we're not sure what the right answer is. We look for a way forward, but the path isn't clear. That's what wilderness will do to us, friends. And so I was up there for some time, and I remember in that time of prayer saying out loud something like this. You've called me to this, God. I'm confident of that. So tell me, where is the blessing next? I'm being faithful. I'm trying to figure this out. Tell me where you're going to lead me. Is it this school or this one or this one or that one? And I would listen and pause and reflect. And again, it wasn't getting me anywhere. But as time progressed, I began to think about it differently. And I began to think, does it even matter which one I choose, or do I need to just perhaps pick? I began to think maybe God's blessing is in any of these roads that we travel. Maybe I was caught up on the details of where, but God was more concerned about the yes that I'd already said to explore this journey, even though I didn't know where it led. And as I was walking on the mountain there outside of LA and thinking these thoughts and processing through it, I tripped over something. Now, at first I was a little bit frustrated that my prayer time would be interrupted by something as nominal as tripping. But then I went back to where I had tripped and I saw something sticking out of the dirt, out of the ground there. And so I began to kick at it, and it took me a minute to pull it up. And what I pulled up was a license plate cover that said, "Believe it." Having just voiced the possibility that the blessing would be in any of the options, any of the roads ahead that I was considering, I tripped over a piece of metal that was stamped, "Believe it." And that, for me, was grace found in the wilderness. Just as it is typical in the scriptures for there to be these experiences of wilderness, so too is it typical that God shows up in the middle of them. And everything that we've been reading over this last month from Jeremiah 29 and 30 and today from chapter 31, all of it has been words of grace for those who have found themselves in a season of wilderness. This is for those who have found themselves in a literal season of wilderness. Remember the experience of the exiles to whom Jeremiah is writing. They had a home, they lived in and around Jerusalem, and they had power and autonomy, and they were well-to-do, and they were well-connected, and things seemed okay. And then the Babylonian Empire comes in and they take away their control, they take away their power, they take away their money, they take away their autonomy, and they begin to control how they live, and things progress and things get worse and people die and the city begins to be destroyed in sections and then eventually almost leveled. And so they've experienced this loss, but then this is what happens to these people in particular. The group is taken from Jerusalem, and they're carted for hundreds of miles across a literal desert to the city where they now live, to the Babylonian capital. These are people to whom Jeremiah is writing, to whom God is speaking, that know the literal wilderness of traveling through the desert. It was a journey that many did not survive. So when God is talking, when Jeremiah is writing to these people, the words are being received by people who literally know what it is to experience wilderness. But this word that God gives, it also comes to those who knew the metaphorical wilderness of being in a place where they were not liked, where they were not wanted, where they were not valued. They were meant to be controlled. They were not free. They were not autonomous. They were living in a place that they didn't belong. They were living in a place that they didn't want to be, where they weren't wanted. They were living in a place that didn't feel like home. Friends, they were living in the wilderness of one of the largest cities in the ancient world. There in the midst of all of those thousands and thousands of people feeling distant, alone, and lost. And it is in the midst of that wilderness that they receive grace. It's what God does. Believe it. They have received grace in the instruction to settle, to build, to plant, to marry, and to celebrate. We talked about that the first week. They received instruction to seek the welfare of their oppressors, to seek the well-being of the city where they lived, even though it didn't feel like home. And then last week they received the promise that autonomy will be theirs once again, that God is still their God and they are still God's people, and that doesn't change. And then today's reading, this morning we read from the 31st chapter. This is a part of the words of hope from the book of comfort, or the book of consolation, that we started last week, beginning in verse 2 of chapter 31. Thus says the Lord, the people who survived the sword found grace in the wilderness. When Israel sought for rest, the Lord appeared to him from far away. I have loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore, I have continued my faithfulness to you, and I will build you again, and you shall be built, O Virgin Israel. Again, you shall take your tambourines, go forth in the dance of merrymakers. Again, you shall plant vineyards on the mountains of Samaria. The planters shall plant and shall enjoy the fruit. And there shall be a day when centennials will call in the hill country of Ephraim, come, let us go up to Zion, to the Lord our God. May God add blessing to our reading and our understanding of these words. This week, I have a bit of a different question for you. I wonder how you're feeling about politics this weekend. I wonder how you're thinking about elections this morning. After all, we have just 65 days until the election comes. I don't know if you knew that. You have 45 days is the last day to register. October 14th is when early voting begins, and October 22nd is the last day for an advance ballot. It's all right around the corner. Are you ready for it? If you're not, or you're not sure, you can check the Secretary of State's office, or you can go to the voternetwork.org. Remember, they've been a partner with us through these last few weeks in this series, in this month, as we've been asking the question together, what does it mean to seek after the common good? How do we live, act, work, serve, vote for the common good? How do we communicate, listen, pray, challenge, grow, give for the common good? Or as our friends at the neighboring movement have phrased it, how do we tend the soil, our shared universal soil, even with those with whom we disagree? How do we tend the soil in order to create growth? So here we are, 65 days left, and the Republican and Democratic conventions have wrapped up. Are you feeling inspired? Moved? Motivated? Did you catch your favorite politician saying something these last couple weeks? I personally have been trying to decide whether the socially distanced conventions made them worse or better, but I'll let you decide that for yourself. Here's the thing. I know that all this talk of voting in politics, that it often leaves some feeling anything but inspired or moved or motivated. I know that because we see less than 60% voter turnout in the U.S. I know that because oftentimes in our own civic systems, in our own communities, we feel like outsiders. Well, if you'll go with me, perhaps even like exiles, wanderers without a home. While we all experience that someplace in our lives, it is especially true for many around this season. We exist within a system within the U.S. that by and large requires us to choose between a relatively limited number of choices. If you can't choose between 2 or 3 or 4 choices, what do? It's one of the things that I struggle with in our system. And so what happens sometimes is that we make a choice begrudgingly or half-heartedly. Sometimes we frame it, and this isn't language that I'm especially fond of, we frame it as having to choose between the lesser of 2 evils. Sometimes we feel like we have to give up something that's important so that we can get other things that are important to us or support one candidate or another. And I think what often happens in that, and I think this is part of why we see so much anger in our system, is that oftentimes we feel the need to aggressively go all in and defend our candidate or our party in order to cover for our own uncertainty. Rather than focus on that which we're not sure, we decide that if we just vilify the other candidate, the other side enough, then we can feel confident and comfortable about ourselves. We entrench ourselves in a dichotomy. If it's not this, then it must be that. If you're not in, then you're out. If you aren't for, then you must be against. I want to say something as a small aside. I tried to find a more delicate way to put this into the sermon series, but I haven't said it yet in this last week, and I think it's important, and I want you to hear this. I hope that together we can remember that this November, candidates will win or lose based on the number of votes or electoral votes that they get. That's how voting works. But, friends, the church will win or lose based on behavior, based on how we listen, how we speak, how we engage. Our friends at the neighboring movement in Wichita, they take it one step further. Our communities will only win when both the winners and the losers engage in the work to cultivate the healthiest soil, the healthiest community, the healthiest place for people and families to grow that is possible. So perhaps that can be one of your voter guidelines, no matter which box you check this November, that we as a community, we as a church will win or lose, not based on the votes, but on how we treat other people. Because whether you find yourself at home with one political affiliation or another really makes little difference to me. What matters to me as your pastor is the behavior that we exhibit, particularly towards those who we don't agree with. In our day and age, it seems like to promote civility in conversations, especially around politics or civics, it's almost foreign to us. Because we think dualistically, we like dichotomies. And while that's how we talk about political things, maybe it's not that new. One of the things that we've talked about these last few weeks from our scriptures is that there was a lot of debate, there was a lot of conversation among the people of Israel after the Babylonians came in about what they should do. There was a lot of division about how they should respond. And so that happens in a lot of different ways. There are factions arguing with one another. But one of the most common arguments we haven't touched yet, and I want to end with it this week. One of the most common arguments was that it had to be one of 2 ways. Either God is good, God is with us, God is for us, and God will liberate us from this time of trouble. Or God is weak, God is distant, God is inept, and God has left us in this moment of desolation by ourselves. Either or. It's this or that. That was the central debate of the day. That was the heart of the issue, the main dichotomy, the primary argument, and all of the other arguments sort of were based on your opinion of that. This or that. And yet, the heart of what we've been reading these last few weeks is that God's thinking is, as it tends to be, bigger than ours. It is beyond ours. What our scriptures have told us from the first week of this series, when the exiles were told to build and to plan and to marry and to have children, to the following week when they were told to seek the welfare of the place where they were, to last week when they were told that God's blessing was still with them. They were still God's people and God was for them and would continue to work towards their restoration. What all of this can be summarized with is our reading today. They found grace in the wilderness. That's the underlying theme. God is not either distant or with us in conquering. No, God is with us in the wilderness and the difficulty and will remain and stay with us. God is not waiting to bless us. God is blessing us even in the midst of this time of struggle and difficulty. Friends, even in our moments of distance, of wilderness, and of dissonance, God is continuing to stay with us, to reside with us, to lead us, and to bless us. That is the truth of these words that God gives to the exiles in Jeremiah 29, 30, and 31, that even in the wilderness, we might find grace. And if we're not careful, friends, we may spend so much time looking up and looking out and looking beyond that we might just trip over the truth. And we might just find that indeed we are people who can say we found grace in the wilderness. Believe it. Amen. Why don't you take a few moments of reflection?